Are there any questions? Marcela. Wait for the mic so we can get it on the video.
Thank you. I wonder if I could ask you about this concern about protectionism in a hard environment and the perception, it might not be fair, that Brazil has in some ways been at fault or to blame for the lack of progress toward a free trade area of the Americas. Where does your government stand now on trying to do something on trade integration for the Americas in the current environment?
Well, that's a very good question. Let me tell you that I'll raise a couple of points here. First, the main perhaps obstacle to an agreement in our FTAA was agriculture. Brazil and Argentina, we have an Argentinian diplomat here in the room. We are competitive in terms of the production of agricultural products. And in reality, what was offered to us in terms of market access was not enough to justify demands, high demands in other areas, like in the opening of our industrial sectors in terms of rules in the areas of investment, intellectual property, WTO plus perhaps rules. And this is on the one hand. On the other hand, our private sector was against it. So in a democracy, it's very difficult for a government to agree with something if your stakeholders back home are against it. This is a very important point I would like to stress. I think that at present things have changed. I see the Brazilian private sector eager to engage, in trade negotiations, not only regional, bilateral, but also at multilateral level. I must recognize now, of course, that it's understandable why the U.S. didn't want to open its agricultural market for Brazil in the negotiations of the FTAA. I say it's understandable, not that I agree with that reasoning, but because you can only deal with agricultural subsidies at multilateral level. It's too bad that we haven't been able to conclude the Doha round yet, because for the first time we would see some ambition in agriculture in the WTO and GATT system. I think we haven't been able to conclude this round yet. I'm sure that one day we'll be able to conclude the Doha round. I think that the Obama administration has a very important role to play here, because, see, I call your attention to an article by Paul Sotero. I read it in the Washington Post. I think it was a Saturday or Sunday edition. And he went straight to the point. The successful conclusion of the Doha round may be the difference between a recession and a depression worldwide. Because when, of course, countries face a recession, protectionist forces gain momentum. And in reality, the Doha round would be the best antidote against these domestic pressures. We may regret it if we're not able to conclude this round by the end, at least have modalities for NAM and agriculture by the end of this year. But anyway, one day we'll conclude this round. I think in this will pave the way for perhaps for us to think once more about an FTA in the Americas. Brazil has an open mind. We don't, I see a little fatigue in the US in relation to trade liberalization. This is not the case in Brazil. We don't have this fatigue because we're still a rather closed economy. On the contrary, we're looking forward to engage more and more in this globalized world. Would you like to add something?
Yeah, just a couple of things. Marcela, we talked about this already privately, but I think that the perception is that Brazil kind of blocked FTA is partly justified because there were interests in Brazil, political interests, to play it that way. Reality, the failure of FTA was a joint production of Brazil and the United States for precisely, or in part for the reason Carlos Henrique just mentioned. If the progressive government of President Obama doesn't deal with agricultural subsidies, it will remain like that. There is a risk, though, for in this, and I think more for the United States and for Brazil. Brazil is a very productive country agriculturally. We have, in a sense, reinvented agriculture in Brazil because we have a lot of land, a lot of water, a lot of sun, and 35 years of technology investment in this. Brazil is just starting in agriculture. It was interesting after the failure of the recent inconclusive deal in Doha. A former senior officer of the agricultural department under President Cardoso said, we just should forget about it and concentrate in Brazil in solving the problems that are here that make us less competitive today, having to do with infrastructure, having to do with phytosanitary things, etc., because that is where we lose part of our comparative advantage, assuming that we attack those issues internally, the part of the homework that we know we have still to do in Brazil. I think the American farmers should think about what they want to do in the future, because if Brazil continues at the current pace and investing in improving infrastructure, in improving methods in Brazil, improving production, Brazilian agriculture will outcompete American agriculture internationally, subsidies and all. So the money that the United States spends subsidizing agriculture will be a waste of money because we are going to dislocate your products in third markets if we do what a growing number of Brazilians are saying that we have to do. It's our problem. And that's what changes the scenario. That's what actually makes Brazil also comfortable at going to Doha now, as our foreign minister did in the very last round, to align ourselves more with the American and the European position, to get closer to that position and more distant to the G20 position that we helped tactically to create in order to change the format of the table. So I think in this area, I think really the ball is mostly here in Washington, what the United States is going to do in terms of the policies. I think there is room to deal with the issues that have to be included in trade deals as far as environmental issues, as far as labor issues. They are legitimate issues. But it's a question of leadership, and it's going to be very tough because it's not easy to deal with those issues when you have the largest, the deepest recession in 50 years. But, those are situations that exist to test great leaders. So.
I'd just like to, if you allow me, just to make a final comment. Excuse me. When you say Brazil is blamed, now India was blamed for something, you must be careful because, we're dealing with very, very able and experienced negotiators. And a part of this negotiations is to do blame shifting, We could also say that it was U.S. fault. We could also say that in the case of the FTAs, for being so stubborn in terms of agriculture, because you see, there is a clearly imbalance here. Brazil cannot export to the U.S. poultry, bovine meat, orange juice, ethanol, so on and so forth. If there is local production in the U.S. and if this production is inefficient, we just cannot enter your market. This is not fair. Of course, you'll say, but Brazil is a big country and this and that. Fine. We're exporting to for instance, to the European Union. The Europeans are a little bit more, let's say, sophisticated because they like to manage trade. But anyway, they don't have enough land, so they cannot be self-sufficient in agriculture. But if the U.S. intends to be self-sufficient in agriculture, that may hurt a country like Brazil, but it kills a country, Africa, like Burkina Faso, Mali in Africa. You just kill them, and they are competitive. They can produce cotton, more competitively than Brazil and the United States, but they cannot export their product. That's totally unfair. And I wonder, as taxpayers and consumers, this is obscene, quite frankly. We must be careful because this blame shifting, In July, India, of course, of course, the U.S. is part to blame too. How can, India and the U.S. did not reach an agreement over a very technical issue, but the U.S. and India can reach an agreement on nuclear energy, which is extremely complex. That will never convince me. Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes, Martin.
Martin Klingstein, the Washington bureau chief of the German weekly Die Zeit. I have two questions. You were talking about the remittances, and I would like to know how large that contribution is to the Mexican economy, because I know that there have been some discussions in the Mexican parliament about the lack of remittances and how it affects its economy, and I know that some villages and towns in the middle of Mexico are deeply dependent on remittances. So I would like to know, how that is going to work, and maybe if you all have an eagle's view on Latin America. Looking at Latin America 35 years ago, it went politically through different times, and I would like to know if this enormous crisis is going to affect also Latin America politically, or how stable its democracies are to cope with the current crises. Thank you.
Right. The remittances in Mexico, in terms of the macroeconomy, are not that large. They're 3% of GDP. So they do have an impact, but not on the economy. It's in Central American countries, it could be between 10 and 20% in some countries of GDP. In those cases, a change in the remittances flow obviously has a macro impact. The problem for Mexico is more localized, how it affects the places in which you have entire populations depending on the flow of remittances. And those are, certainly going to face an increase in poverty as a result of the reduction that, in the case of Mexico, apparently has already started. I think it's one of the few countries in which they document the fall in the amount of remittances. And the second, I'm an economist. I'm not a political scientist, so I'm always hesitant about making predictions on the political side. But I think that it is going to put a lot of regimes under stress because they're, particularly if you look at let's call, the more radical or populist leftist governments, which have banked on primarily providing a number of subsidies in different forms that have actually occurred, they may not be sustainable. So how that is going to affect the outcomes in terms of democracy, elections, etc., I don't know, because it depends on how the people in power also respond to this. But for sure we'll have a lot of stress. And in the case of Mexico, I think you're seeing a reconstitution of the PRI, which has been happening in the last few years. So it may not be surprising that also the economic situation may be favorable for a comeback, not necessarily of the left, but of the PRI.
I am very optimistic about all of this. I don't think that the fact that populist regimes come under stress, it's probably good for democracy. It's not bad for democracy. As long as they do elections in the periods that are As long as they keep what they decided among themselves, do it, respect the results, fair campaigning. You know, we had in Venezuela, by the way, 2 elections already that have been pretty decent, fair. A referendum that the president lost, another one recently where he, again, won some and lost some. I think the process is important. There are certain countries. I followed Mexico starting in '93. I see Mexico becoming more democratic, not less, with all the problems, and some of the problems related to the drug wars, etc., are horrible. I don't see any. I see problems in the operations of democracy in Brazil. I think there is plenty of room for improvement. But then I see plenty of room for improvement in all countries of the world, starting here. I think that there isn't those notions that from time to time people come with the Latino barometer things and say, oh, people don't like, they don't trust that. I think there is great doses of baloney and all that. You know, democracy is like oxygen. Take it away and see how people will react. Once we have it, we have those debates about nuances, this and that, but I don't see that there is a danger to, and I have to see it country by country. As far as Brazil, I have absolutely no doubt that there is more participation in processes, there is more denunciation of corruption, there are even people getting to trial now and being found guilty and put into jail, which is kind of new to us, accountability. So, you know, it's something that actually President Bush said in Brasilia when he visited there in November of 2005 in a speech that was written by Condoleezza Rice, reminding people that it took 100 years in the United States from emancipation to the Voting Rights Act. Democracy, it's a very difficult thing to build and to keep and to maintain, and even advanced democracies with excellent foundational laws can go bad from time to time. So I think that in this one, I think the direction continues to be positive in the region in general and in Brazil and in the major countries, Brazil, bigger countries, Mexico, I have no doubt about Chile, and actually, and I have no doubt that in countries like, even in the countries that are governed by the populists, you know, the fact that you have an indigenous leader in Bolivia, to me, means more democracy, not less.
And on behalf of India, thank you, Mr. Sotero. I'm sorry to, just for time purposes, we're going to wrap up now, but I just wanted to thank our panelists individually and collectively for taking the time to come speak to us today on such an issue. We'll certainly continue to work on this.
Prepared the panel, the sort of construct that came up, and it's in a lot of the literature, is you know, the classic line that when America sneezes, Latin America catches a cold, and the truth is we've caught more than we've got a cold. We're not just sneezing, and the truth is, if you look across the markets, I believe that Latin America is not acting as bad as we would have thought in the past. In other words, and I think Ambassador Moreno's comments sort of laid that out, that Latin America is in a stronger position than we would have thought. But I do think that a further integration of the region will probably benefit, and the crisis will allow probably Obama to take a much more multilateral approach, both on a financial basis as well as on a political basis. But I wanted to thank all of you. It was a wonderful presentation, and look forward to further discussion.